Hey everyone, it's Jenny at jccards.com, and today I'm joining you with 3 cards that I've created using the December 2018 Spellbinders Small Die of the Month. Each of the cards uses similar products, but I'm going to show you how you can change up what you do to get very different looks. I'm going to show you first off a card that's very simple to make, followed by one that's slightly more difficult, and then a shaker card. So let's get started. This is the die. It comes with a number of circular sentiments, some corresponding vines, florals and a leaf. And I'm also going to be combining it with Watercolor Cardstock by Holtz and these 3 colours of distress ink, Tattered Rose, Milled Lavender and Tumbled Glass. I think these colours go really well together and they create a lovely soft palette. First off, I've adhered a sheet of the Holtz Watercolor Cardstock to my craft mat using painter's tape. I've been careful to make sure that the border around the edge of the sheet is relatively even because, as you'll see later on, I'm not going to trim down this piece of cardstock. I'm going to use the masked edges to create the border on my card. I'm then smushing down each of the ink pads onto my craft mat, spritzing with a tiny amount of water and then using a large round brush to paint stripes across the panel. I haven't wet the panel, so this is just the water that I've spritzed onto the smushed inks on my mat, which will then allow each of the colours to softly blend into each other. Once my panel is dried, I'm going to repeat that with a second layer. Again, I'm not using any water on the panel itself, and I'm just letting the colours blend into each other softly so that you get a nice graduated blend between the colours. You can use a heat tool to speed up the drying time, but I like the look of naturally dried panels when I'm using this technique because I think you get a more natural blend between the colours themselves. In order to avoid any water leaking underneath the painter's tape, as I go I'm also using a paper towel just to go around the edges and mop up any excess water that you can see beading at the sides. Once my panel is dry, I've taken some water, just some clear water, and I'm flicking it onto the panel. Distress inks will react with water and wick away to create a speckled look. As a finishing touch, I'm going to add some gold shimmer spray. So I'm using Heidi Swap's Colour Shine in gold. However, I know that's a little more challenging to get hold of nowadays. There are alternatives such as the antique gold from Altenew, or you could of course use any shimmery metallic spray from your stash. I've used the circular From All of Us sentiment die from the set, and I've die cut it from white cardstock. I also used the circle die in the set to die cut that sentiment out to create a mask. I've then laid that over the centre of my panel and spritzed liberally with the Colour Shine gold to create a shadow area where the mask was placed. I'm then drying it with my heat tool and I'm going to remove the painter's tape, and there's the border that I mentioned earlier. I've die cut the sentiment out again in the exact same way from white cardstock, and I'm using liquid adhesive and adhering it directly to the centre of my panel. I've offset it slightly so that the shadow area behind the piece peeps out and creates an almost 3-dimensional look, even though this is a very flat, almost 1-layer card. For an extra bit of shimmer, I'm using my clear Wink of Stella and going all over the die cut to add a bit of sparkle. I'm then adhering the panel down with double-sided tape directly to a white card base. I've put a lot of double-sided tape here to avoid warping from the watercolour cardstock. And as a finishing touch, I'm adding some Studio Katia iridescent bubbles just in a few places on the card. These bubble jewels are some of my favourite embellishments. They are so pretty in real life and they really catch some of the colours that you add onto your projects and complement them. And this is the finished card. Right, moving on to the second card. This one we're going to step it up a little bit. We're using the exact same colours of distress inks and we're also using watercolour cardstock. So I have cut several of the vines from the die set, from Holtz Watercolor Cardstock, from Glitter Silver Cardstock, and also you'll see later on from Vellum as well. I've also cut the circular birthday sentiment using the circle die and the sentiment die, and I've also cut a plain circle, both from watercolour cardstock, and I've cut several of the small leaves from the set in watercolour cardstock as well. When I'm making cards like this, I like to do all my die cutting at the start so that I have everything that I need to hand and I can put my card together almost like a jigsaw at the end when I've embellished everything I need to. So what I'm doing is very similar to before. I'm smushing down the ink pads onto my craft mat and I've spritzed them with a little bit of water, and then I'm using a paintbrush to paint on the ink very roughly onto the die cuts. I'm just letting the water bead up and then I'm pushing it to one side and leaving it to dry naturally. And what that gives is a nice kind of distressed watercolour look for each of the vines that we've created here. I've cut down a panel of spicy yogurt cardstock, which is probably my favourite specialty cardstock. It's by Altenew. It's kind of an off cream with lots of sort of black speckles bedded into it. So I've cut that down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and that's going to form the base of our card panel. I'm taking the circle of watercolour cardstock that I've cut earlier, and I'm smushing it into a couple of the ink colours. The reason for that is I'm going to be overlaying the sentiment on top, and I just wanted a little bit of colour behind the sentiment so that it doesn't fully blend in and it can be more easily seen. I've adhered the circle and the sentiment together with liquid adhesive, and then I've put 3 or 4 foam squares onto the back of the circular sentiment, and I'm adhering it down onto the centre of the spicy yogurt card panel. Be careful not to put too much foam tape on, because what we're going to be doing, as you'll see here, is tucking each of the die cut vines behind the sentiment. So you need some wiggle room and some space for each of the die cuts to be placed. I'm then taking each of the vines and tucking them in a sort of circular fashion around the die cut to create a messy wreath. It looks like I'm placing the vines at random, but what I'm trying to make sure I don't do is include 2 colours together that are the same. So, you know, the blues and the pinks are together, the purples and the pinks are together, but I don't have pink and pink or silver and silver. I'm also tucking some vellum in there as well, and I'm only adding glue at one end, which is the end behind the die cut sentiment, and at the end I can then fluff up the vines so that it adds a little bit of dimension, even though I'm not using any foam tape. I've added the leaves, 4 or 5 of the leaves around the wreath with some foam tape just to add a little bit more interest. And then I've used the Heidi Swap Colour Shine spray to add a few gold spatters. I did protect the sentiment in the centre with a piece of paper to avoid getting spatters on there. And then I've scattered a few of the iridescent bubbles to finish. And that completes this card. For my final card, I had to create a shaker. These circular sentiments in the Spellbinders set are just scream shaker to me. So I've used the same 3 colours of distress ink, and I've smushed them a couple of times on the centre of my craft mat, and then I'm spritzing again with water. I'm then taking a panel of Tim Holtz watercolour cardstock and I'm dipping it into the smushed inks. I'm dipping it a few times, then I'm going to dry it with my heat tool, dip it again, dry it with my heat tool, and dip it again, and just keep repeating until I get the look that I want. I'm then going to add lots of splatters using the Heidi Swap Gold Colour Shine. I'm going to basically take out the sprayer and tap it over the panel until I have lots of gold splatters. I'm also going to use a small paintbrush to get more fine spatters as well. I then dried the panel with my heat tool because we're going to die cut it. So I'm using a circular die from the set, and I've die cut the circle directly out of the centre. I've then overlaid one of the circular sentiments from the set over the circle that has been cut out for that panel and rerun it through my die cutting machine. And what that gives you, as you saw earlier, is a standalone sentiment. The cool thing about these circular sentiments in this set is you can actually die cut them from a panel, or you can use the coordinating borders, so the plain circle, or there's a scalloped border as well, to create standalone circular sentiments, which is pretty cool. You are probably going to need a pokey tool on hand just to remove some of the pieces that might end up getting stuck inside. I do recommend using a metal shim in your machine so that you get a nice clean cut. Okay, we're now going to put together our shaker. So I'm using some liquid adhesive on the back of the panel, and I'm adding a small square of acetate behind it. I'm then going to create a double layer of foam tape right round the circle itself. So I'm using 3M foam tape. I've removed the backers because that makes it much easier to bend around the shape of the circle. So when I get to one end and cut it off, I'm then going to do another layer, and the extra depth will mean that your sequins or your shaker contents won't get stuck when you shake it. You need that extra double layer. Be sure to add foam tape in a double layer across the rest of the panel as well. I'm using a sequin mix by Little Things by Lucy's, and I'm adding some into the centre and then adding a panel of white cardstock at the back just to close up my shaker. There will be some edges hanging over which I will just trim off with some scissors. And there's the shake card. For the sentiment, we're taking the circular sentiment we cut earlier, adding some liquid adhesive and adhering it directly over the acetate window. So that way it coordinates perfectly with our back panel, almost seamlessly, but you can still see the sequins peeping through the front. I'm then going to use the circle die and the scallop circle and run it through my die cutting machine together to create this white circular border. I'm adding a little bit of liquid adhesive and adhering it directly onto the card front to create a border between the shaker circle and the rest of the back panel, just to add a little bit of contrast. I've then die cut the vine dies twice, once from Vellum and once from some matte silver cardstock and some silver glitter cardstock. I'm adhering them down as we did before for the wreath card, with the Vellum first and then slightly offset the glitter and the metallic mirror silver cardstock as well, just overhanging the window at the front of our card. I've cut one of the flower dies from white cardstock, which I've adhered with a foam square into the centre where the vines meet, and I've puffed up the petals to add a little bit of dimension, and for a finishing touch I've added a drop of Nuvo crystal drops. I can't remember the colour I used, but it'll be in the detailed description below. And just to avoid the point, just tap the card and it will slightly flatten out. And that finishes the card. That's all today. I hope you've enjoyed and that this gave you some ideas on how you can use the new Spellbinders Small Die of the Month December set. If you've enjoyed, I hope you'd consider subscribing to my channel, and here's a couple of other videos that you might also like. Thanks so much for watching and have an awesome day. Bye!